I'm the public policy director at GLSEN, and we are, for the past 3 decades, one of the leading LGBTQ organizations working in the education space. And there's not a shortage of issues that we are working on, and particularly in partnership with all of you. Just to center today's conversation, at the end of the day, I think we all understand what we want is a school environment that works for kids and sets them up for success. And parents and families are such a critical part of that process, as are our partners in the school community, such as educators and principals. And it truly takes a village to help ensure that kids get the best start to life and have all the tools that they need to succeed and thrive in life as well. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the years is that we have a lot of room for improvement here as well. And one of the greatest challenges that we have is particularly in making sure that kids have both the confidence and the self-esteem to move forward and to address several mental health conditions that can manifest among young kids as well. Unfortunately, we've been tracking issues like depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation for the last 3 decades. And we know that that is a problem writ large across the youth population. Suicide, unfortunately, is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds. And we know that LGBTQ teenagers are at even heightened risk. Every couple of years, GLSEN conducts a national school climate survey. And we surveyed over 22,000 LGBTQ individuals in 2021. That survey is online. We'll share it with you as well. But what we have found year after year is that high rates of LGBTQ teenagers in school are bullied, harassed, or assaulted by their peers. In our last iteration, we saw 83% of LGBTQ individuals faced in-person victimization in school. That, of course, affects their academic performance, as well as their feeling of belonging in the school and broader community, as well as their mental health, when we think again about depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. One of the greatest challenges for LGBTQ kids is around underreporting. There's a lack of communication and a lack of confidence that schools will be able to accurately and efficiently handle their concerns. 62% of LGBTQ individuals never report an incident to school staff. And of those who do report, more than 2/3 are not satisfied with the response from the school. And so there's a lot of work to be done here. And a big gap in why schools have not been responsive and trusted by LGBTQ kids is, in fact, that the legal protections around LGBTQ individuals and students in schools have not been clear over the years. And so today we are here to talk about Title IX and how Title IX will hopefully soon be updated to provide clearer protections and then provide a pathway for schools to work in concert with parents and families to come up with broader solutions that will help increase the inclusivity of a school environment. So over the years, before I dive in, I just want to highlight GLSEN's fundamental approach to how to create an inclusive school environment is anchored in our 4 core supports. We believe strongly that inclusive curriculum helps serve as a mirror to students' own identities. So when kids see themselves in the books that they're reading, in what they're learning in history class, that plays a critical role in their self-esteem and confidence. Student-led groups that create safe, peer spaces like gay-straight alliances or gender sexuality alliances is our 2nd core support. The 3rd is supportive educators, making sure that kids feel there's a safe space in the school, someone that they can talk to. And then 4th, and this is where Title IX comes in, is comprehensive policies, and making sure that not only are there the protections for students, but that the school districts are really articulating all of the policies that are needed to clarify situations and make sure that everyone in the school community is working to support kids. Now, of course, over the last couple years, we have seen a lot of efforts at the state and local level to erode the protections that are available to LGBTQ kids. As I've said, the legal protections have never been particularly clear. And so without clarity in the law, we've seen those who are hostile to LGBTQ rights try to erode whatever protections have existed. So many of you are familiar with the policies that have come up. So-called Parents' Bill of Rights policies, which we know are not really about all parents, but about particular parents who have a specific view of what schools should look like. And so it's really critical that we continue to push back against that narrative and reclaim what it means for parents to be involved in education. Curriculum censorship and book bans, a huge issue as well. That is not necessarily going to be tied up in federal policy, but what we have seen is that very few students have access to a diverse curriculum and diverse resources that reflect the LGBTQ identity. Only 16% of LGBTQ kids are taught positive depictions of their own community, and less than half have access to LGBTQ inclusive library resources, with only 7% of LGBTQ students having access to many library resources that reflect the LGBTQ identity. And as we all know from fighting the book banning movement over the last several years, LGBTQ stories are one of the first on the chopping block when it comes to complaints and challenges to school libraries. Another big piece that we've seen is sports and facilities bans, problems where educators are not affirming students in the classroom when it comes to names, pronouns, gender expression, and appearance. And then unfortunately, over the last 2 years, we've seen an increase in what we call forced outing policies, where schools are required by their school board or by the state to disclose a student's gender identity or sexual orientation to the parent over the student's objection as well. And so some of these challenges can be addressed through Title IX, and some of these will continue to have to be addressed through pushing at the state and local level as well. And we'll talk through that in just a moment. But before I dive in, let's talk about what is Title IX and how did we get to this particular moment where it could be updated to provide greater protection for LGBTQ students. So I'm sure all of you have probably heard of Title IX at some point. It's been around for over 50 years. It is a federal law passed in the 1970s to prevent the discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs and activities. And this has been interpreted for some time to have some level of extension to sexual orientation and gender identity, but it's never been spelled out in the letter of the law. Just to provide a little bit of a history lesson, back in 1989, the Supreme Court was analyzing employment discrimination statutes and came up with a doctrine called sex stereotyping in a suit called Pricewaterhouse versus Hopkins. And in that case, Ms. Hopkins was up for a promotion as partner, but she did not dress as the male partners had expected. She did not act in a feminine manner as the male partners expected, and therefore she was denied that promotion. And in a rather landmark case, the Supreme Court said that the protections under employment sex discrimination law should extend, even though she was not discriminated against because she is a woman. She was discriminated because of the stereotypes and expectations of what it meant to be a woman. And so that doctrine of sex stereotyping plays a really critical role into the evolution of how Title IX has been applied over the last 3 decades. And just a fun little tidbit for us to all be aware of, that doctrine of sex stereotyping was authored by none other than Justice Antonin Scalia. And so that goes to show that this is not, some extraordinary radical interpretation of Title IX, but the fact that gender and sex expectations being interpreted as sex discrimination is a long-standing doctrine written by none other than the hero of the right wing, Justice Scalia. And then, of course, all of us are likely familiar. A couple of years ago, there was a Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County, that interpreted that same law around employment discrimination and found that once and for all, that sexual orientation and gender identity can be folded in to the sex discrimination law and considered under that law as well. And so what we see now is coming out of that decades-long judicial evaluation of what sex discrimination laws include, We now see an opportunity where the Biden-Harris administration is evaluating the Title IX regulations and has proposed some significant shifts that would incorporate and provide greater protections for LGBTQ students. First and foremost, what's been proposed is including sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics in the definition of Title IX. And so that means that when a student goes to complain and file a complaint with their Title IX coordinator in the school district, there will be an option to check sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics. And that enumeration makes a big deal because right now, a fifth grader or an eighth grader may not necessarily have gone through 30 years of jurisprudence at the Supreme Court to understand that distinction, that sexual orientation is protected. And so having the clarity there in Title IX regulations is a huge step forward in addressing that issue around underreporting. And so that's going to really change the game when we think of bullying, when we think of harassment, when we think of discrimination in school settings, how children will now have a new outlet for relief and a new avenue to address their concerns as well. Another big piece, and this goes back to one of the pieces we're handling at the state and local level, is around facilities bans. So unfortunately, several states have banned particularly transgender and non-binary students from being able to access bathrooms and locker rooms and other gender-separated spaces consistent with their gender identity. And there's an increasing focus from the far right on leaning in on the quote-unquote biological sex, even though it seems the far right doesn't know that a birth certificate can be amended and that children can, in fact, change that on their legal documents as well. And so what the Title IX regulations have proposed is that it does not say that we're going to suddenly move to all gender bathrooms and remove gender separated spaces from the school context. But when there is a gender separated space, the school cannot perform more than minimal harm to students when separating them based on gender. And notably, the proposed rule says that separating students on the basis rather treating students in a manner inconsistent with their gender identity constitutes more than minimal harm. And so the rule certainly paves the way for us to be addressing at the state and local level some of these bathroom and facilities bans because it demonstrates that there is going to be harm to the students, something that we have known for quite some time. Of course, I remember when Gavin Grimm went before the Supreme Court several years ago, coming out of a Virginia case, and we know that there continues to be really high rates of school-based discrimination against students, withholding them from being able to access facilities on the basis of their gender identity. More than 2/3 of transgender and non-binary students report that they do not have access to facilities consistent with their gender identity. And the third bucket of big changes in the Title IX rule is around athletics. And this has been a quite robust conversation over the last couple years, and one where I think groups like yours and certainly groups like mine can play a large role in helping to provide some visibility and facts at the local level. And so what we see coming out of the Biden administration is that the Biden administration has proposed a rules change that says that when it comes to sports, school sports, that there cannot be a categorical ban on the basis of gender identity. So a school cannot prohibit students from participating in sports because they're transgender or non-binary. However, unfortunately, the Biden administration has created a caveat that allows school boards to come up with criteria, and the state may do so as well, to come up with criteria that can limit participation in sports on the basis of grade level and degree of competition and the individual sport. So a school district may say, in high school lacrosse, we may be putting certain restrictions on because of these different criteria that are not related to gender identity that the school will come up with. And so unfortunately, that opens the door to a lot of activism at the local level, where I would expect that certain elements will want to use those quote unquote neutral justifications as a basis to continue to exclude trans and non-binary students from sports participation. Now, when we zoom out a bit, I think a lot of the conversation around school sports has really been focused at two things. It's been focused at an undue focus on competition, as if, you know, 8th grade intramural soccer is the same level of competition as the Olympics. And that is something the Biden administration has sought to differentiate, is that level of competition is certainly different depending on your grade level, depending on the level of sport. Is it an intramural sport? Is it interscholastic, and so on? And so that's a big piece that we need to sort of reclaim and say, you know, I keep hearing from the other side that school sports, the purpose is to win, and that is not the purpose of school sports. The purpose of school sports is to teach leadership and teamwork. It is to promote physical activity, and it is to promote a more well-rounded education for students. That's why it's anchored in the schools, is that it is a part of the education experience as well. And so there are many reasons for school sports. It is not all about the competition. So I think fighting back against that is a really critical piece. And then the second piece is, unfortunately, there are many elements that are seeking to cloak their concern around transgender and non-binary sports participation in a faux concern around women's sports. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that when there are discriminatory policies with respect to transgender and non-binary students, it actually has a spillover effect on cisgender students as well. It is that, you know, it really subjects kids to inappropriate scrutiny about their bodies. It creates a sort of dangerous witch hunt where any parent can kind of file a complaint against a student, regardless of whether they're transgender or non-binary or so on. And unfortunately, it has a disproportionate impact on students of color who may not necessarily conform with societal expectations of femininity as well. And so we have seen in the data that that states with inclusive policies actually have greater increases in women's sports participation than states with exclusionary policies. And so it goes to show that many of these arguments are, first of all, from the other side, are not necessarily based in fact, and certainly are leaning in more on the fear-mongering than they are on actually substantively engaging in the dialogue about what it means to be participating in school sports. And so we as GLSEN and many other organizations urged the Biden administration to go a little further with its athletics rule. Unfortunately, we are not privy to the process. We don't know what the Biden administration is thinking while they're considering finalizing the rule. But if the final rule comes out similar to how the proposed rule comes out, it will be an important step forward, because a lot of states have these categorical bans on sports participation that are quite discriminatory. But it will also create a bit of opportunity for the other side to continue the argument in school board meetings and with state governments. And so that's an area where it will be really critical that you all show up, that we're going to show up in, and that we continue to just provide clear information about why it's important to not have discriminatory policies in place, especially in K-12 schools. And so those are the three main buckets of Title IX. We've got enumerating sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics in Title IX, extending the protections of Title IX to these particular student groups. We have the clarification that gender-separated spaces cannot deny individuals on the basis of their gender identity. It constitutes more than minimal harm. And we have the new balance that's been proposed on athletics. Now, when does this become legally enforceable? That's the heart of the question as well. So right now, these are just proposals from the Biden administration. In order for them to become legally enforceable, the Biden administration has to finalize these rules. And what we've seen is that the Biden administration had hoped to do that last year, and in their latest update has signaled that these rules will come out in March of this year. And so I would expect some level of action in the spring, which is just 2 months away, and could come up on us really quickly. And I think we all know the environment we're working in. Right now, a lot of state legislatures continue to be passing anti-LGBTQ policies. We know that school boards continue to be considering many different pieces around LGBTQ students. We know that there are debates in Congress and at the national level that can really have a big factor on where things go as well. And so when these rules drop, it's going to be really important that all of the concerned communities, parents, educators, allies, as well as LGBTQ kids, really rise up and speak in that moment about how historic the rules changes are and how it means school boards and states need to change their policies to implement affirming policies instead. And so that's going to look very different depending on where you are. So I'm in Washington, D.C., for example, and one of the big pieces we're working on is implementing inclusive curriculum. And that is going to look very different. And Julie, I'm going to pick on you from Suburban, Ohio, where you've got school board members that are working to advance different policies that harm LGBTQ kids as well. And certainly in Ohio, where they just passed a sports ban that would actually run into conflict with these proposed Title IX rules. And so it's going to look a little different for everyone, but the call remains the same, is that there is opportunity for you to engage at all levels. Congress will need to hear the importance of these rules because we know there are going to be those in Congress that will work to reverse the rules the minute they are implemented. And we know that the state level folks need to hear about the importance because the governors and the state departments of education will have to take a look at their policies and consider what changes and what doesn't change and what they can try and get away with. To be frank, some states may even try to sue the Biden administration to maintain their discriminatory policies instead of having to follow the new federal rules. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to kind of pressure the state. And then, of course, the school boards is where it's going to be really critical to show up and play a role because school boards will have the opportunity to take a look at their policies individually, regardless of what the guidance is coming from the state. There may be rooms to, even if the state is not supportive, there may be some room for tweaking to get into compliance with the new rules. And then certainly around sports as well, I would expect that to be an area where school boards may have a level of discretion they didn't have before, or they weren't thinking about before. And there's a big opportunity to get ahead of some of the opposition and get inclusive policies in and really encourage that from the get-go. So I will take a moment to step back and see where the questions are and look forward to hearing what's on your minds as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump in. I just want to ask a few questions myself, some of the things I sent you ahead of time, Brian. And then I see questions dropping in the chat, so we will definitely jump to Julie to take those. Can you just kind of explain, I was curious, Title IX's been around for a while. What prompted the Biden administration to come forward and make these changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I want to zoom out for a moment and make it clear that the Title IX changes don't impact just LGBTQ students. There are a number of really great changes happening in addressing campus sexual assault and providing clarity for pregnant and parenting students as well. And so, this is a more comprehensive look. But from the LGBTQ perspective, there's kind of two intervening factors that have happened. Is first, the Bostock decision is that there's been an interpretation from the Supreme Court that federal sex discrimination law is inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. So with that having happened, it's important to take a look at Title IX and see how that changes Title IX policy. And again, including the enumeration, of course, is important, but also thinking through the permutations of where particularly gender identity requires some new rules, such as around bathrooms and sports, was a big part of this rulemaking. And another big piece is that there have been a lot of school districts that have asked for clarity around their responsibilities as well. And there's a lot, things are moving quickly. New data came out, I think, in the last couple of weeks showing that an even larger share than ever before of the latest generation is identifying as LGBTQ. There are a number of intersections around, I think, this question around outing and social media use and data privacy that school districts are grappling with. And frankly, the Title IX rule is not going to get into issues of social media use. And however, that doesn't mean that instances of cyberbullying can't be interpreted under bullying protections under Title IX, right? So, it's really important, and school districts have been kind of voicing this to the department and asking for updates because there's been such a shift in the landscape of and visibility of LGBTQ students writ large.
You've touched on a ton of things in terms of like access to facilities and obviously sports bans. You talked about forced outing. What do you anticipate will be, and this is a big question, so answer however you want. What do you think will be the biggest impact of these changes in terms of some of these pretty horrific rules that are coming out from our policies from school boards? That's a broad question. I understand that, but I'm just kind of trying to visualize as a student, like how they're going to use these rules and like really what they can be like making those big impacts that we need to see, these changes that we need to see.
Yeah, I think that's really key. I think the most visible piece is going to be around bathroom bans, which I think we're up to 10 states now, and sports bans, which we're up to 24 states. And so under the rule, ideally, both of those would not be found consistent with Title IX, and therefore we would have that very visible action of states being in conflict with Title IX, Title IX being a federal law, preempting that. I have learned not to say trump that law anymore, but preempt that law, and being able to get those off the books and then ideally put inclusive policies in their stead. But however, I would say, and I always say that the follow through of policy work is never glamorous or sexy, but it is important. And I think having really addressing that underreporting and that lack of confidence in school response piece is so critical because we know there are such high rates of bullying, harassment, and discrimination in schools. We know that kids go through the ringer sometimes. And if the policy shift is so subtle, but it makes a difference for the LGBTQ kids that are bullied and harassed, it can have a huge change on their trajectories as well. And so, that's what I think is going to be really exciting, but it may not be the most visible piece in the kind of coming weeks after a Title IX rule is published by the federal government.
So what do you anticipate will be the reaction from the opposition? Because we know that they're just not going to sit there and take this.
Yes.
What are you anticipating, at maybe the federal and or the state level from people who would oppose these rule changes?
Yeah, and so I think, of course, this will continue to be one of the biggest wedge issues that the opposition continues to bring. And we know that this is part of a broader effort to undermine public schools, and it's not just limited to targeting the most marginalized students, but it's part of an effort to really undermine the incredible project of what public education is in a multicultural democracy. And so, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball of, the bigger concern here. However, when it comes to specifics, I think, and I teased a bit of it, is you're going to have states that probably sue the Biden administration to keep their discriminatory policies in place. You're probably going to see efforts to reverse the Title IX rule in Congress. In fact, just in December, so last month, there was a representative from Michigan who introduced the second bill that would implement a national ban on transgender students being able to access sports. And this one goes further than ever before and prevents transgender students from accessing intramural sports as well. And so it really goes to show, again, they're laying all their cards on the table. It's not about competition anymore. It's about exclusion and targeting certain students. And so, I think we need to call a spade and continue to fight. But I would say we will see efforts in Congress to reverse this. We will see litigation. We will see pretty bitter fights in the state level and at the school boards. Unfortunately, I think this might reinvigorate some of the opposition at the school board level, particularly around sports. And so we have an opportunity to get ahead of it, and hopefully to be prepared when the rule is finalized so that we can get in early and make the case for inclusive policies.
Can you explain what exactly does happen to like a school if they're found that they violated Title IX? Because this is not like you go to jail. So can you just explain the consequences of a Title IX violation?
Right. Yes. And usually what happens, of course, is like the ultimate leverage is that the federal government can withhold funding from a school district. And that rarely happens. Usually school districts will enter some sort of corrective agreement and come up with a collaborative plan with the Department of Education to correct their action and get into compliance. But I think money is on the table when it comes to school districts if they're not in compliance. And I think that's going to be a big piece that we'll see is how effective are corrective actions and kind of the enforcement piece in making sure that we move policies to where they need to be. And it's both policies and practices.
You referenced Title IX officers at school. How do kids go about, or their families, filing Title IX violations? Like, do you need to hire a lawyer, or what's the procedure for this?
Right. Yeah. And so each school district, and so not necessarily every school, but each school district has a Title IX coordinator. And that should be published online, and that should be made available to parents at the beginning of the year, along with other information about the school. And I think a big piece coming out of the Title IX rule as well is going to be the need to elevate know your rights materials. And we have know your rights fact sheets that we put together with the LGBTQ community and the ACLU and the National Women's Law Center. There are legal helplines that are available through National Women's Law Center, Lambda Legal, and National Center for Lesbian Rights and the ACLU. And so, I think that awareness piece is really critical, because that goes back to the underreporting element is claims of bullying and harassment are underreported because kids don't know that they're protected and they don't know how to report it in the first place. Filing a report does not, or a complaint does not require an attorney. But again, those legal helplines are available, and certainly in some cases it can progress beyond just filing a complaint and having an administrative process. And so that's exactly why those resources are available.
Quick question, and I don't want to put you on the spot on this. I'm kind of curious. So you had said, especially around like sports bans, that the Biden administration's rules are allowing for like neutral standards. How do you foresee opposition using those neutral standards to actually prohibit trans students from participating in sports just because they can't use the gender identity explicitly? So I'm just curious for an example. I am sure there are a multitude of ways they will come up with, but I was just curious how you thought that might apply.
Yeah, so unfortunately, and again, we don't know what the final rule will look like, but unfortunately in the proposed rule, the Biden administration specifically calls out two, what we call myths. First is fairness in competition, and secondly is risk of injury prevention. And we certainly know that, first of all, both of those are pretty ambiguous standards that are not defined in the proposed rule. What fairness looks like is very subjective in the first place and is very overly broad. And then secondly, it is not tailored to really address the particular concern. So for example, risk of injury prevention in lacrosse, but if the team doesn't have protective headgear, is that really going to be about the student being transgender, or is it going to be about the lack of safety equipment available to the students on the team? And so, I think that's an area that we were quite concerned about. We commented, and that's why with rules, there's a public comment period, and we hope that the Biden administration tightens that piece up, but they may not. And if that's the case, who will set that standard of what is fairness in competition and what is injury prevention? It will come down to the state departments of education, and it will come down to the school boards. And so you all know from the last couple of years what it'll look like in a school board meeting when that issue comes up.
Oh, yes. Well, we will get everybody prepared for that. So, Julie, I'm going to bring you up here for questions because I see the chat is hopping. And I know before I even started asking Brian questions that there was already questions in the chat about this.
There are a lot. Okay, when the Title IX changes happen, can we challenge the Ohio law?
Yes. And I don't think that I am not privy to the conversations around litigation, but I think that particularly around the gender affirming care pieces in Ohio, which would not be under Title IX, there is a ripe challenge already. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but when it comes to the sports ban piece in particular, the proposed rule indicates that categorical sports bans are not compliant with Title IX. And so there would certainly be an opportunity, I think, to move forward with the challenge.
Okay, and then the next question is, will the Biden administration go after enforcement of these rules in an
I'm guessing election year.
Yeah.
Yes, election year.
And so the way that it works is that so Title IX is the protections that are available to students, and there is a process of they have to file complaints. Those complaints get processed by the U.S. Department of Education, and then after that, there's an opportunity to pursue litigation as well. And so, I think that's where the Know Your Rights piece really kicks in, is that as soon as the rules are published and legally enforceable, it's going to be making sure that students are aware of their rights, they know how to file complaints. And we already know that the U.S. Department of Education processes complaints on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That they, or rather, I don't want to say that they evaluate on cases on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and we saw in the civil rights data collection that they indicate how many cases. So, for example, 19% of cases came to them on the basis of sexual orientation, and they didn't separate out gender identity from sex, but it was, I believe, 40% on the basis of sex, including gender identity. And so we know that as those complaints come to the administration, that they're going to be evaluated and processed, and then eventually a resolution will be issued.
I think sorry, Julie, I think the implication from the question is, like, if this gets controversial and it's an election year, do you see them slow rolling enforcement or any problems or anything just because we're in an election year?
Well, I'm not privy to any discussions, but of course the campaign is different than the government. And at the end of the day, once the legal rights are available to folks can exercise their legal right both through the administrative process and eventually in court.
Can school boards refuse to implement laws that these legislators have passed using Title IX to refuse?
And so that's going to be a question that depends on the posture of legal challenges, I imagine. And so, I don't want to get into hypotheticals here, but I would say that it's going to be a fluid environment for a couple months if there is a legal challenge.
What will the rules say about the physical exam of students to investigate gender? You know how they were trying to do the physical.
Yes. Yeah. And so unfortunately, the proposed rule on athletics did not talk to physical exams specifically. And that is an area that we likewise commented in partnership with the National Center for Transgender Equality, with the National Education Association and others. We really emphasized that the rule should expressly prohibit those sorts of physical exams.
And then this I'm combining too. Are these rules published somewhere, the temporary rules? And what is the timeline on them being released?
So the proposed rules are publicly available. They are on the U.S. Department of Education's website. There are two rules. Again, there's the underlying rule, which is non-discrimination on the basis of sex. And then there's the separate rule on athletics. the first rule was issued in July 2022 and the second one in spring 2023. And so both of those rules are available, and you can read through the very dense administrative law language if you want. But on the flip side, we unfortunately don't know when the rules will be finalized. And in administration, there's no legal obligation for them to actually tell you when it's coming. Often final rules are simply published, and then that is the rule, and it is done and finalized. And the greatest indication we ever have is this unified regulatory agenda, which happens twice a year. They update it and kind of give ballpark estimates, but it changes quite often. And so again, the last information we have from the update in the regulatory agenda in the fall indicates that we'll see this sometime this spring, but that is not a hard and fast deadline. And to an extent, it is also incumbent on all of us to make sure that the Biden administration upholds their promise to update the Title IX regulations and actually gets them out the door, let alone enforces them once they are the law of the land.
So aside from directly suing, if the school doesn't comply, won't it take years for the feds to get to the case?
And I think that touches on an important point, is that there is an underinvestment in civil rights enforcement in this country. And unfortunately, what we saw in the spending fight, which has yet to be resolved, is that the House has proposed bills that would include a 25% cut to the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights at a time when presumably complaints around discrimination on the basis of religion and national origin were spiking earlier this fall. And so, I think that is a really valid point. And to an extent, there are a lot of arguments that are available in court to students on the basis of, for example, equal protection in many of these cases. And we know that there's been litigation on bathroom bans. There's been litigation on a number of these issues in court already. They're not waiting for Title IX to make the arguments. However, Title IX is going to be a really important tool in the arsenal of, in the toolbox rather, that is going to help make the case that sexual orientation and gender identity is protected under federal law, and that schools are not allowed to discriminate in their programs and activities. And so it is not the be-all, end-all, but it is a really critical tool that will be available to kids as they're navigating their own school policies.
So we had some clarity on it on one of our previous questions. The question that the person was really asking was, can the school board right now refuse to implement policies that violate current Title IX? Hers seems very hesitant, and she said they seem to want to pass the policies and wait for a claim to be brought.
Yeah, so I would encourage that person to maybe get in touch with me directly. But I would also say that what we are seeing is, so first of all, what we are seeing is that there is sometimes conflicts between states and school boards. A great example is Virginia, where the State Department of Education recently put out some model policies. They were not legally binding, but model policies that were very anti-trans. And we saw a number of school boards refuse to adopt them. And many of those school boards leaned into their belief that Title IX would protect students against the policies that were being advanced by the Virginia Department of Education. And so that is an example of a school board standing up against optional state policy for the benefit of trans and non-binary students in their districts. But I'm happy to have an offline conversation with the questioner.
Will there be a dear colleague kind of letter for the Title IX coordinators? Because the person said that they're not all on the same page for some of this stuff.
Gosh, I hope so. And, I do think that this is going to be really complicated. And again, with the legal posture of where things land, it's going to be a fluid couple months. I would love nothing more than the final rule is published and immediately everyone moves towards implementing. But as Julie said earlier, we know that the opposition is not going to take this silently. And so it is going to be a fight to implement it. And we're going to look to you and certainly to others to mobilize so that we have a robust coalition that is trumpeting the importance of Title IX. But a big part of that, and this is the unglamorous follow-through work, is training up school staff to understand the responsibilities. It's raising awareness about know your rights, and it's really communicating out what the changes are so that everyone in the school community, again, the educators, the principals, the school counselors, in addition to the parents and community leaders and community resources, everyone understands what these new legal protections are.
Can minor students file a Title IX complaint, or does it have to be a guardian? Basically, the question comes down to who has standing to challenge.
Yeah, and so it is the students' legal rights. However, that a conversation about how to file without parental support is best handled between the student and the Title IX coordinator. And so I would encourage that to be handled at the local level.
What will be done with staff having to be required to use trans students' correct pronouns?
Yes, and so I think this really hits on a key point too, is where is the line going to be drawn around an individual instance of and kind of a pattern. And so I don't know how the U.S. Department of Education will implement this piece. It is certainly on our minds, again, thinking through all elements of affirmation in the classroom: name, pronouns, gender expression, appearance, clothing. All of it is tied up in sex discrimination law, and we have seen Title IX cases, not necessarily in the SOGI context, sexual orientation and gender identity context, but in around appearance and dress code before. And so I would expect that, drawing from that precedent, that there will be that there will hopefully be some strong protections around affirmation more generally.
Will the federal proposals provide guidelines or clarity or minimum definitions regarding level of competition?
Yes, this is a great question, and one that I would say stay tuned for. Again, I think there was a lot of commenting in the public comment period. The administration, under the in any rulemaking, is required to consider the comments and to make changes that they deem necessary. That may be simply considering them. That may mean making substantial changes. So we don't have any clear sign as to where the administration will actually move in this front, or if they will stay with what they've proposed. And so we will have to see what the final rule is. But my hope is that, either there are clear definitions, or frankly, there are just no exclusions for trans and non-binary students at the end of the day.
And that's the end of the questions.
Well, that was perfect timing because we're rolling right up on 8:30. So that was wonderful questions, you all. Thank you so much. Brian, anything you'd like to share before we close out? And also maybe any resources you want to direct people to learn more, or your calls to action, anything you want to say at the end here?
Yeah, so I will start with just saying thank you so much. I hope that when the final rules do come out, that we can all work in partnership together to process what this means for not just defending the rules and making sure that they have broad implementation, but also for supporting everyone in our school community to understand. I will just drop a Know Your Rights resource here in the chat, but I encourage you to look around through our website, and there are a number of resources there, and there will be a number of additional resources in the coming months, including toolkits that we will have around Title IX during the rollout as well, especially interpreting those last minute changes that happen when the final rule is made. And I wouldn't say they're last minute, but those changes that are new to us when the final rule is made. And so we will have a lot more information to share. Of course, really grateful for the partnership with both Julie's and Red Wine and Blue, and we will continue to share info with them that hopefully is shared out with you all as well.
Awesome. Well, we thank you for your time and very, very good information that everybody needs to know. And looking forward to working with you on actually good policies and legislation that's coming down the pike, guys. I live in Ohio. It's not so great here on these issues. So happy to see something positive coming out of the federal government. So thank you, Brian, so much. And everybody have a good rest of your evening. Bye, all.